Good afternoon. Thank you. We better get started. I'm told we're running late. JJC is going to get the bell out again. This session is about landscape, and we feel that there's a need to, as has been already discussed this morning, to consider heritage in a landscape context. So we have three speakers this afternoon. The first is Emeritus Professor David Trigger, who's had a very long career in looking at land relationships in context of native title and heritage in Queensland, Western Australia, and more recently, I believe, in New South Wales. And David's going to be followed by Robin Stevens. Unfortunately, Robin's co-author Sharon Dershaw can't be here today. She's stuck in Bali because of the COVID situation, which I think if you're going to be on an island, certainly, sorry, not Bali, Fiji, certainly Fiji would be much better than being stuck, say, in Manhattan. And our last speaker is Caroline Bird. And I did have Caroline's book here. Caroline's book and her talk is based on this. This will be formally launched this afternoon. Well worth getting, because it puts archaeology, and our co-author Jim is down here, puts archaeology into a landscape context, as she'll explain. Right, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to be able to speak. I do want to acknowledge we're on Noongar country. I just briefly want to say something about my background. So working across various states and territories over the years in negotiations over land and rights. The bottom dot point there makes the obvious point that while there is differences in legislation across the states and the territories, there are similar overlapping issues. And the first slide here draws to some extent on the situation in Queensland, which myself and some others have written about. The legislation there, which in some ways the proposed WA legislation, I think, embraces some aspects of what was passed in Queensland quite some time ago. But what I'm going to talk about here today is a little bit different, I think, from what we've had in the first half of the day, partly because I'm going to talk about money. Not only money, but in the Queensland context, what we've been writing about is that heritage, of course, is not only about culture in terms of negotiations with government and with parties who are seeking to do developments. Heritage at the local level, I mean, leaving aside the economic significance of these developments for government and the wider society, at the local level with Aboriginal communities, heritage can be viewed as partly a way out of poverty, and hence agreement making is a live issue. And I'm sure we've heard the WA Minister and others talk about agreement making as a key aspect of, if you like, what emerges when heritage is being negotiated. Financial stakes are not small. They're not small often in the case of, especially with proponents of large developments, such as large mining companies, where Indigenous people are able to have fees for participating in heritage surveys. But more so than that, of course, everybody in this room who works in this area knows that as an outcome of a lot of these agreements, there are very substantial amounts of money which may go or become part of a working relationship in the light of managing heritage. So the second bottom point on the slide is that I suppose the difference I'm talking about here is that heritage is not solely about culture once we stand back and consider that this is an intercultural arena of negotiations involving law and lawyers, politics, and economic aspirations. And indeed, among Aboriginal people themselves, for all of you who work in this area will know, there can be a tension between conservation of heritage and commodification of it. And I should have said the title at the top of the slide is something we have noted that has developed the last 10, 15 years, particularly in the state of Queensland under that legislation. I wanted to say something, again, standing back, as to the different stakeholders, because the stakeholders here then on the top are, of course, as has been discussed this morning, Indigenous organisations, groups, families and individuals, whose approach, whose focus is around culture and identity, but also around economic advancement and possibilities, I would suggest. Second, we've got heritage professionals, many of us here in the room, archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, many others. And if we think about that approach, it's a science approach. It's also, I think, worth acknowledging that heritage professionals have a career that they're working through. I include myself here. We have the proponents of the projects, second from the bottom, with an economic development approach, and at the bottom we have government. Government interested in policy, regulation, development and political considerations. So as a social scientist, standing back from the question of the management of heritage, I just think it's important to acknowledge this broader arena of intercultural relations that we have going on. I want to run through those stakeholders very briefly. I want to talk about, again, something I would be surprised if anybody in the room is unfamiliar with. So clearly, in terms of the Indigenous parties, the importance of heritage and culture and spiritual attachment, as has been discussed today. I've got a small example here just from a Pilbara survey I did quite some time ago in the late 90s. I thought I'd use it because of the seniority of the older people I was working with in the West Pilbara. Yilbawari talked about the spiritual attachment as something being in there in the country. And secondly, commenting on the intercultural relationship, as he did, working with me, that reflecting on how is it possible or for whitefellas to appreciate this spirituality. And I think as heritage professionals, we need to consider that across the wider society as well. If we're going to move outside of the people in our room here, our colleagues who are largely not of one mind, but on the same track, and we want to bring a major sector of the post-settler Australian society with us into understanding and respecting Indigenous heritage, then we need to address the question of spirituality and the spiritual significance, and how does that happen for people who don't grow up with an Indigenous background. And just a few brief photos of Yilbawari at the bottom. I'm sorry, that's doing it by itself there. Rightio. Couple of photos of my colleagues in Injibandi and Ngalama country, actually, and talking about the spirituality of the land. And of course, Ralph Whalebone and Vincent Lockyer there introducing themselves to the spirituality of the country in the way that many of you would be familiar with. But I think there are complications that, again, we are familiar with in terms of engaging with the spiritual significance of country for Aboriginal people. Who knows about the place? Is it many people? Is it only one person? Is nobody know now about the spirituality of the place and it has to be rediscovered? What do the documents say? Do the documents that the heritage professional works with say it's a significant place, or have there been previous studies saying that it's not? Younger people, are they more or less interested in preservation, conservation than older people? Is there a contest of reputation that the process inevitably engages with, where, as a number of people have spoken about today, it's not necessarily the case that all the Indigenous parties, families and individuals are going to be in agreement? What is the importance of money benefits across the social field that's considering the question of heritage? There is a heritage economy, as I said, for all the parties. And there's likely to be a range of different views. What kinds of sites are there? What kinds of significance? Again, colleagues from archaeology are speaking about the importance of recognising heritage at a sort of broad cultural landscape level. At the same time, here we have Kenny Gerald holding a single stone artefact and talking about the significance of one piece of stone. And of course, having trouble with this, and then comparing that to major spiritual dreaming places across landscapes. So all parts of the cultural landscape are not regarded as an equivalent or the same. And in native title work and other legal cases, the idea of a diverse Indigenous jural public, the public of people who've got something to say about what kinds of heritage values belong to what sorts of places, you know, to individual stone tools or to a whole cultural landscape. The negotiations within and among the Indigenous people with whom we engage can be vigorous. And I have to add the second bottom dot point there, that it's not the case necessarily that all of the people who belong to the relevant jural public will be the same as PBC members or the group of named, determined native title holders. So the question of what can be developed, what can be sacrificed in the light of beneficial agreements is a vigorous discussion. And then we move to the heritage professionals fairly concisely. If we characterise that approach, looking at it as a sort of a intercultural arena of negotiations, well, there's a science approach, recognising very clear from the excellent presentations this morning the significance of heritage, in this case Indigenous heritage, in understanding a wider human story. With all kinds of techniques in archaeology of a range of kind, including establishing time sequences, in anthropology, trying to understand cross-culturally the spirituality of the land and senses of place, and with history, the story of settler colonialism and the way it impacts, of course, on what the cultural values might be at this point in time. And I have to say, you're all familiar with the fact that most cultural heritage professionals generally have a political commitment to the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples. And one of the accusations is that that is a focus more so on cultural rights than the importance of economic advancement. This debate is being had at the moment in WA in terms of the new legislation. And some of the complications for heritage professionals. What happens when the findings of the professionals actually clash or differ from Indigenous cultural beliefs? It's not an abstract question. For those who work in the area, I've got a few examples there. Disagreements possibly about identifying objects as actually human produced or modified. whether trees, whether stone materials, stone arrangements, whether the stories of historical events that are there on the ground are contradicted by written sources, so the historians or the anthropologist has to put the two together, whether claimed descent from certain deceased forebears may not be supported by other genealogies. Well, I don't answer that question here. I just suggest, in terms of the bottom dot point there especially, that heritage work is not for the faint-hearted, that we do have an intercultural relationship here, and the scientific inquiry is not always the same as the Indigenous perspective. And then the second dot point there, the criticism from proponents and government at the moment, actually, in the public domain, accusing heritage science of being driven by self-interest and a desire to get rich from consultancies, or having tunnel vision that ignores the importance of financial benefits for the wider society, but also for Aboriginal people. These are the kinds of issues that are around that I want to point us to in terms of the intercultural arena that heritage operates in. Moving to the proponents of projects, well, an economic development approach, a main driver, a desire for a successful business, a profitable business. But the second dot point there also, if we do research with proponents, especially in big projects, there's no shortage of people who will articulate a very strong belief that what they're doing is not just making money, or at least that the economic significance of their work flows over to things that are good for the wider society. And probably the most controversial thing, if I might say, if I'm saying any, is the bottom dot point there, that also there are non-Aboriginal senses of place. And one really interesting question is, going back to my proposition that if we're trying to bring people on board to the significance of place and identity, we can ask the questions of, well, what's important for those non-Aboriginal stakeholders, not just in economic terms, but do they have a sense of place and home? Can they put together their own reflections on their own background with what people are trying to explain to them in terms of Indigenous senses of place? So here we have in the Pilbara, I took this photo many years ago, a celebration at Murajuga, the Burrup, a monument and a plaque celebrating the sacrifices, particularly focused on the injuries and so on that the quite a number of workers actually, you know, you can imagine building that stuff, you know, serious effects on their lives. So there they are, they're saying, yes, we're building an economic development, but we've got a sense of history in place as well. And then, of course, we have the monument to the Flying Foam massacre up there, thanks to photo actually to Ken Mulvaney, who's kindly provided this. So a sort of a shared coexisting landscape with different meanings, if you like. We also have what a number of writers call a history of reckless indifference. So yes, while the non-Indigenous elements of celebrating work and life in the land is there, of course we know from all across Australia we've also had an enormously reckless indifference in displacing Indigenous heritage and just displacing, for example, in this case, place names, so that the mountain that Tom Price got called Mount Nameless, but we know it's got, I think it is a Guruma name. And that photo is actually from one of the Yinnawanka elders, Lola Young, and her quotation in the Karajini Centre, where she talks about, of course, they called it Mount Nameless, but her point was that's just been reckless indifference. We know that it's got a name and it's had that name for a long time. So we have this complications. Oh, sorry, I missed one again. I think things are changing though, and we see for the Northwest there in the tourist web page, at least in 2020 now, we do have the recognition of the Guruma name for Mount Nameless. So it's different from when I took those earlier photos. What I'm trying to point us to is simply that we have some complications. We've got spiritual connections on the one hand, we've got land as a commodity on the other. Both of those cultural values come to the fore, most commonly in discussions about heritage, but I think it's also worthwhile sitting back and asking questions about whether there are overlaps, and if so, of what kind. History and sense of place might be said to be important to all people. Living in an area, working and having effort on the land, significant to all people. And so we get to the question down the bottom. Can the wider society, including families who've got many generations in this Australia, and also much more recently arrived migrants, can they learn to respect the sorts of things that were discussed before lunch in Aboriginal heritage, in part by at least beginning to reflect on their own senses of place? And I'm being asked to finish, and that's the last slide, which is simply to pose the question about coexistence. Thank you very much.